Hi, I'm Mark Ayler and I'm a Sony Digital Imaging Ambassador, and in this custom settings video tutorial I aim to show you a lot of the settings to do with Sony's finder and monitor on your Alpha camera. Now undoubtedly there's probably going to be a few more settings that are useful that you didn't first realize was there, so we're going to unpick this in a great deal of detail. Now this is just one section of the ebooks that I make available on my Alpha support channel. Now, I cover most of the late model Alpha cameras, so if you're interested in picking up one of these, just head over to patreon.com/Mark Ayler. I've got a wealth of learning resources available on this support channel. Okay, so the electronic viewfinder, or EVF, is sometimes just simply referred to as the finder, and of course then we have the monitor. Tucked alongside the finder we have a diopter adjustment dial, so if you don't want to be wearing your glasses you might be able to pull sharp focus just by making a small adjustment to this diopter adjustment dial. Now another important thing that I see on the forums a lot is some people saying that their monitor no longer appears to be working, and so invariably I have to remind them that you need to keep the proximity sensor just by that finder clean, otherwise the camera thinks that something is close to the viewfinder and so therefore wants to switch from the monitor to that finder view. Sony are basically using two different designs for their monitors now. We have the 4-axis multi-angle LCD monitor that we see on their premium cameras, and we have the vari-angle LCD monitor. Obviously that 4-axis multi-angle monitor is the most useful because we can have tilt without moving the monitor away from the camera, and we also have a lot more flexibility when shooting in the vertical orientation. Now that has appeared on at least 3 top tier cameras. Hopefully it will work its way down to some more of the entry-level models over time. The monitor resolution has grown over time, but we're basically using either the 1 million dot 3-inch monitor found on the smaller and entry-level cameras, and the slightly larger 3.2 inch which has over 2 million dots on the premium level cameras such as the A7SII, Alpha 1.2 and Alpha 9.3 cameras. The resolution of these finders and monitors are referred to in dots, and all camera manufacturers do this, and I'm not too sure why they do it because most people are more familiar with resolution stated in pixels. So we have to actually divide dots by 3, the red, green and blue dots that make up a single pixel. So if we divide that 2 million dot count on the premium level monitors by 3, we end up with just a shade under 700,000 pixels. Even that doesn't make a lot of sense until we basically do the maths on this and we work out that it's approximately 1020 by 680 pixels in dimensions. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it is pulling a resolution of over 400 ppi, and so that is about as detailed as you actually want on the monitor. If you're wanting for more detail, then you probably want to start looking through the finder of your camera. So for instance on the A7 IV we're over 3.5 million dots, and on the premium level ones we're over or approaching 9.5 million dots. Just remember the resolution of the finder may be lowered when the display quality is set to standard, the anti-flicker shoot is set to on, or the finder frame rate is set to high or higher. Refer to your individual camera manual if you're looking at when that resolution may drop. Just because you have the 9.4 million dot premium level finder on your camera, it doesn't mean to say that you'll always be using that high resolution, so you need to be aware of when that resolution drops. Now if we go into the setup menu, you will see dedicated finder monitor settings. We have their display quality. Just make sure that is set to high if you're wanting to see absolutely the sharpest amount of detail. And this is quite important when we're checking focus, etc. Now you might notice that when the finder frame rate moves from standard to high or high plus or higher, then the display quality might be grayed out or maybe dropping down to the standard display quality. Now we have the finder frame rate on most late model alpha cameras that can be set at standard, or if we're shooting fast moving action and the camera is panning quite quickly, we might need to bump that up to the high frames per second. Now on the premium level A alpha 1, 2 and the sporting cameras, resolution of the finder might not drop significantly or at all, but on all of the other cameras you will notice that resolution does take a hit there. Now if I'm listing all of the finder specifications of all of the various models, there's a lot of settings that relate to the finder, such as resolution, size, eye point, magnification, refresh rate. There's also one missing from this list, which is brightness, but that's not listing it here because Sony don't actually publish the brightness values of their monitors in a value called nits. So we have to rely on a lot of reviewers to basically evaluate whether the finder is much brighter than previous generations. Many people, for instance, said that when they were reviewing the Alpha 6700 camera, the viewfinder looked twice as bright as previous versions. Okay, so we'll leave that standard or setting out of this particular table, but you can see the resolution climbs with the premium level cameras. The size also climbs with those premium level cameras. The eye point, this is how far you can move your eye away from the viewfinder and still see the full view. So obviously we can move our eye a little bit further away from that viewfinder on the premium level models. Magnification, obviously the closer to 1 the better, I think, and that is you'll notice that the subject size looks basically the same size as the human vision when we're using a focal length of approximately 50 millimeters. So we got a 0.9 times magnification on the premium level cameras. Interestingly, it actually goes over 1 on the Alpha 6700 camera. Refresh rate, as I said, the higher refresh rates are useful for sports photography scenarios, and we do have the higher 240 frames per second on all of those sporting models, including the Alpha 1, Alpha 1, 2 and also the older Alpha 9 cameras there. So I will often raise it to 240 frames per second only when I'm panning the camera really rapidly when I'm doing motorsports photography. It just helps me get a clear view of what I'm doing. Now this is probably overkill for slow moving subjects, so I would recommend either the standard or just the high in most other instances. Now there is a possibility to reduce the viewfinder magnification on the premium level models such as the Alpha 9 III, Alpha 7R5, Alpha 1 and Alpha 1 II. Now why would you want to reduce that viewfinder magnification? For photographers who wear glasses, we're now given a choice whether to zoom out or reduce the viewfinder magnification or to make the diopter adjustment via that dial next to the finder. Perhaps one of the most significant differences between the cameras we're using now and the older DSLR style cameras is we get a live view directly from the sensor up to the finder and onto the monitor. Now the DSLRs, we were getting a view from a mirror, and that is a very different kettle of fish. With this live view, and we're getting a distinct advantage by having this live view, is we get a WYSIWYG view. That is a what you see is what you get view. We're constantly previewing the depth of field as we make adjustments to the aperture, and we're constantly getting updated information as to the exposure when we increase or decrease the exposure. And this means that we're having to chimp or review the images a lot less because we're basically getting what we were seeing at the point where we depress the shutter release. So as we make exposure compensations, for instance, so we're going to see those effects in that live view. So as we increase exposure, things are going to get brighter. As we decrease exposure, things are going to get darker in the viewfinder. So if it doesn't look quite right in the finder, then odds on it isn't right, and we may need to make an exposure adjustment. So for instance, if your scene is predominantly made up of darker tones, there is a risk of overexposing. So we often do a negative exposure compensation to make those darks dark again rather than just a mid-tone. And the opposite is true is when the scene is made up of dominant light tones. There is a risk now that we're going to underexpose the file. So this leads to a positive exposure compensation. And we can monitor that just by the appearance in the viewfinder and also by looking at the histogram as well, which is one of the display views we have an option for. Now I prefer not actually to use the histogram but to use the zebra function. And because I'm a RAW shooter, rather than setting it to 100 plus, I set it to lower limit 109 plus. So when I start seeing the brightest highlights with the zebras there, I just reduce the exposure until the zebras disappear from view. And I outline this in a separate video tutorial and also in the ebooks. We have settings to do with live view because sometimes we may need to modify those live view settings. So let's take a look inside of that shooting menu at some of the options we're given. We want to adjust those live view settings when we're working with flash. We're wanting to basically go down to exposure effect and set it to exposure set and flash when we're working with flash on location, and rather than flash being the fill light, it's actually now the primary light source, and we're going to get a better view if we're actually setting that to exposure set and flash. If we're working with flash in a very dark studio, however, we actually do want to turn the setting effect to off. Failure to modify the live view display settings when working in a darkened studio with a flash will result in a dark monitor and finder view. Now this is another popular question on the forums, is people are in a studio working with flash and they're going, I can't see to focus, and then often if they're getting a good response, it will be to remind them that you need to go into the setting effects and switch that to off. So we can quite clearly see to focus and frame the image. It's important to note at this point, however, we're no longer previewing whether the exposure is appropriate, and we're also now previewing the scene through the close to maximum aperture. So we're not going to be able to preview depth of field when the setting effect is off. So Sony have given us another couple of options here for photographers working in these type of situations. If you do work in a studio with flash a lot, I would probably want to add live view display option to the FN menu, because you're going to be wanting to enable that and disable that quite frequently. So rather than deep diving into the main menus, you can actually park it in the FN menu. One of the things that we can do when the setting effect is off is we can assign a couple of custom keys to preview the depth of field and also momentarily or temporarily preview how the ambient light is contributing to the overall exposure. So this is aperture preview. I can actually see what my f5.6 aperture is doing. So the other thing that I can do is press a custom key that is assigned to something called shot result preview. This temporarily enables the setting effect just so I can see how much the ambient light is contributing to the overall exposure. This needs to be set up. Obviously we need to go into the custom key dial settings and assign two custom keys to aperture preview and shot result preview. Now these options only appear when assigning a function to a custom key. You will not see the aperture preview and shot result preview in the main menus until you come into assigning custom keys. So if you're just scrolling through the main menus, they're not going to be there. Both of the custom keys that I recommend assigning these options to is the C1 custom key and the AF on custom button there. And the reason for that is these two buttons appear on Sony's Bluetooth remote. So I can actually access both of these options from the remote rather than touching the camera. And that might be of great value to a lot of studio photographers. Touch display. For all late model alpha cameras, not only we had the option for touch focus, but we can also have a range of touch options including menus. So let's look at this in a lot more detail. On all of the latest cameras, for instance, we now have a shooting screen with icon displays. These icons will not appear if the touch function is off, And if you want to quickly enable and disable a touch function, it's usually done by the trash can button there. It's only a trash can when we're deleting files in playback mode. So this is an effective custom key for enabling and disabling the touch function operation at all of the times. So we can basically swipe these in, and when we no longer need access to these icons, we can swipe them out of view. Rather than pressing the function FN button, we can just simply swipe up to access the function menu. Now the function menus have the 12 options, and we can configure these. Unlike the icon display with the swiping in from left and right, we can actually customize these 12 options. And on the latest touch model options, we don't really have to go and deep dive into the menus. For the FN menu settings, we can simply long press one of these options and deep dive straight into the FN menu settings if we want to reprogram one of those 12 options there. So it's a way of just fast tracking into the FN menu. Okay, so the shooting screen, touch operation, we can have a little bit more control over how these things work if we go into the main menu. So we go into the setup, touch operation, touch panel settings, and shooting screen. And then you can see we've got a whole range of options that we can fine tune. Now, one of the other things that we can fine tune, as well as having icon displays both appearing when we swipe or only left or right appearing, we also have options over the footer icon touch. These are basically 4 settings to do with exposure, such as shutter speed, aperture, exposure compensation, and ISO. And so rather than going to the physical hard controls on the camera, we basically can press one of these and make adjustments to the exposure settings of the camera. So let's come to touch function in shooting, which is one of those options in that menu. So as you can see, I've got this set up for touch tracking, which I find is the most useful of these options. So we've come to touch operation, touch panel settings, shooting screen to access these. But I have to say we can also access these touch function in shooting options from the icons that appear when we swipe in and swipe out. You can see it appears over there on the right side. So we can change from touch tracking to touch focus or automatic exposure if we want to modify those settings there. Now there is also an option where in touch tracking where we can have just touch tracking or also link it to the automatic exposure as well. This might be useful for some, maybe more so when video shooting, because we can touch to start tracking that subject, and then we can swipe left or right to increase or decrease exposure. So it's worth playing with this one because some will find this quite useful. Touch AF when using the finder. Now this is quite useful, or will be for some photographers, not all. So especially for cameras that maybe don't have the joystick or multi-selector, instead of pressing the center button and moving the focus point, we can simply slide our thumb onto the monitor, which now becomes a touch pad, and then move a crosshair over to a different subject, and then when we let go of our thumb, it will immediately start pulling focus or start tracking that alternative subject. Touch focus would be useful in video if we just want to pull or track focus between two different points in the frame. Touch tracking is probably more useful if your subject is moving that you're about to start tracking. So you'd move the cursor over to that one, let go, and as well as pulling focus, it also starts tracking, so that either you can move or the subject can move and focus will be maintained. Now if you've ever come into this scenario, you see the focus point is in the lower right hand side of the frame here, and again it's a lot of people ask this question: why does my focus point keep appearing in the bottom right hand corner? And it's because you've got touch functionality set to on, and your nose touches the screen, and that's where the focus point moves directly to. So there's a way of avoiding this issue without disabling touch function, because you might be wanting to use touch focus as the touchpad. So the secret to this is going into the touch operation, setup, touch operation, touchpad settings, and assigning the operation area just to the upper right hand corner. That means your thumb must start in the upper right hand corner to start moving that focus point around. But it does mean that if your nose touches the monitor in that bottom right hand corner when your eye is at the finder, you're not going to pull focus in that bottom right hand corner. There you go, problem solved. Auto switch view. This was not normally a complicated thing, or one that we had a lot of options over. Basically, when we move from the monitor to the finder, the view would switch between those two. Then what happened is, as we had tilting monitors, Sony enabled the option where if we pulled the monitor slightly away from the camera body, now the view was maintained on the monitor only. So even if we looked through the finder, the view would not switch. So with the very latest model cameras now, we're given more options about how that switching actually occurs. So let's take a look at Auto 1 switching and Auto 2 switching. If you've got an entry level or older camera, you may not have this Auto 2 switching option. Now, when you're looking at the menus, if you press that trash can, you will be given the option to get an in-camera guide that helps to describe the menu item that you're thinking of choosing. Sometimes they're quite clear from the in-camera guide, but in these instances, I find the descriptions of Auto 1 and Auto 2 not that clear. So I'm going to dispense with the in-camera guides there and just give my own interpretation of this. Auto 1, view does not switch to the finder when the monitor is at an angle. If the monitor is pulled out or away from the camera body, then the view will not switch back to the finder even when you look through that finder. Auto 2 means that the monitor can be pulled away. It can basically be at any angle from the camera body, but if you look through that finder, the view will switch from that monitor. This might be very useful for videographers who just want to check focus in that much higher resolution finder before continuing, but basically they're using the monitor for the framing that they're doing during the process of shooting that video clip. Let's have a look at some of the other useful display options we have. This one is called Grid Line Display. You can see I've come to the shooting menu, shooting display, grid line type. Now the latest model cameras again might give you a new grid line type which is called golden ratio, which is sort of a classic version of the rule of thirds. I actually find this a little bit more useful than rule of thirds in most instances. But if you are looking for the overlay, and in this instance I'm showcasing the older style rule of thirds, you can see this might help compose your subject and putting that horizon line right on that upper line on that rule of thirds. So if you're looking for a very precise compositional tool, this might be useful for you. Another one I find this especially useful is something called marker display. Because we're using 3:2 aspect ratio sensors, if we're aware that most of the people viewing our images are not using monitors with a 3:2 aspect ratio, mostly they're using monitors with a 16:9 aspect ratio, which is slightly wide view there, you'll see that we often would find it better not to see everything in a 3:2 aspect ratio. Some people might want to actually shoot in the 16:9 aspect ratio, so they're not looking at things on the bottom of the frame and the top of the frame that is not going to be in the view. But the marker display does something a little bit different. It actually just darkens the area that is outside of your compositional choice. So here we're looking at a wider aspect ratio. I can still see what is above and below those areas, but it does help me compose within just the bright area of the monitor. So we have a few controls here. We can basically enable and disable aspect marker, but we've also got the aspect marker type and aspect marker level. So the aspect marker type is actually the aspect ratio. So we can choose 1:1, which is a square aspect ratio. We've got 5:4, 4:3. We don't have 3:2 because that is the native aspect ratio of the sensor. Then we got the wider views, which is 16:9, and then we got the really wide views, which is sort of the cinemascope or scope views, which is 1.91 to 1 and 2.35 to 1. So these will possibly give you what you're looking for to actually frame up your image. The aspect marker level is basically controlling how dark those areas above and below the view are going to appear. So with both of these tools, you should get the view that will help you make the perfect composition when you're taking shots or creating a video clip. Let's take a look at power save options, because these are new for the newer style monitors. Now that we can turn the monitor in and close that monitor so it's facing the body, we can set a power save by monitor closing function there. So if we go into the setup menu and go to the power setting option, you can see I've got power setting by monitor both linked. So the both linked means that it starts the power save mode when closing the monitor inward and ends the power save mode when the monitor is opened. Now I've modified the in-camera guide description here because again it was just a little bit ambiguous, so I've just simplified that in this particular description here. Now if you're forgetting to close the monitor face in, and then the next time you get the camera out of your bag and the battery is flat, the biggest culprit for that is your Bluetooth has been left on. So this is one of the biggest accidental draining of batteries known to alpha users, is basically you've had Bluetooth on because maybe you're using a remote or you've connected your camera to your smartphone, but when you're not using those, you really need to get into the habit of disabling Bluetooth because that is a great way of draining your battery when putting the camera in the camera bag and forgetting to switch it off. Let's take a look at the important subject of brightness here for the monitor and viewfinder. Let's concentrate on the monitor brightness in this instance. Now I'll often just set +2 as my default monitor brightness. It does mean that I'll be draining my battery slightly faster. The only time I really want to lower that brightness of the monitor to 0 or a negative value is if I'm taking photos in very low ambient light. I don't really want a very bright monitor that might be leading me to a false sense of security about how well exposed my images are. But most of the time when I'm taking pictures in bright ambient conditions, that will be at +2. In really sunny weather, I will actually up the brightness even more by choosing the option called sunny weather. And now that is absolutely the brightest setting that your monitor can be pumped up to. And you might need this if the sunlight is falling onto the monitor of your camera. And because I'll be wanting to adjust the monitor brightness quite frequently, I will park that option in the My menu settings. Another option for brightness of monitor is when we're shooting at nighttime when things are completely dark, because at very long exposures we'll struggle to actually frame the image at all and not be able to see things like the star systems. So there is an option called bright monitoring which really pumps up the monitor brightness so we can see to frame the image. So again, we need to go into the custom key dial settings if we want to assign a custom key for bright monitoring, and a lot of astrophotographers have probably already done this. Another way we can adjust the look of the view of the monitor and also the viewfinder is a setting called D-Range Optimizer. This can increase or decrease the contrast, because in very contrast situations where the shadows are really quite dark, D-Range Optimizer or Dynamic Range Optimizer will lighten the overly dark shadows, thereby reducing contrast. Now, a lot of raw photography shooters will often say, why do my images always look a little bit darker on my computer screen than they did in the camera? And that is because the D-range optimizer is on by default, but doesn't get applied to raw files. It gets applied to JPEGs and also movies when we're not using the picture profiles, but it doesn't get applied to the raw files. So the shadows are always going to be a little bit darker on those raw files when we open them up in a program such as Lightroom. Another way of controlling the contrast on the viewfinder and also the monitor is to go into your creative look settings, exposure, color and tone, creative look. Then just choose one of the creative looks and then navigate to the right, so we can then start adjusting some of the custom parameters there. Now, contrast is going to be perhaps the one you want to access most often, but you can see if I keep on cycling right, I've got individual control over highlights, shadows, fade, saturation, sharpness range, and clarity. Now again, all of these get applied to JPEGs and movies when we're not using the picture profiles, but again, all of these do not get applied to raw files. It's just a way of controlling the look in the viewfinder and on the monitor, so we're getting a good view when we're taking photographs. Let's take a look at the display views. So we have a display button. Now, a lot of newcomers to the alpha cameras don't realize that repeatedly pressing that display button on the top of that control wheel will cycle through different views or different levels of information, from everything just to the histogram, just to the level of the camera, and for what's sometimes called for viewfinder, where we don't get a view of the scene we're photographing. For photographers who are primarily using the finder on the camera, we can see all of the breakdown of the camera settings being used on that for viewfinder view. Now again, a few photographers don't realize that we can actually access and change some of the settings from this particular screen. We just need to press the FN button, and then we can navigate to the option or menu that we're looking to modify, and then we'll be able to modify that particular menu item without again going deep diving into the main menus of the camera. Now let's take a look at display settings, setup, operation, customize. We're coming into the display screen, display set, and we're coming into the what views we actually get to see when we keep pressing that display button. Because we don't have to cycle through all of them, we can disable some of those views. For instance, if you never use the level or the for viewfinder view, you can uncheck those boxes and then save that as to reduce the number of options that you're having to cycle through. There is an interesting one with the no display info. Is on the later model cameras we can always display just the exposure parameters, shutter speed, aperture, exposure compensation, and ISO, but we can have those values time out. So I'm going to walk you through the timeout one. The settings that we can see on the bottom of this frame are only visible when we're making these adjustments, and after a few seconds of not making any adjustments, they're going to fade out of view or disappear, and that might be a useful compositional tool again for you. When we're hitting that display button in playback mode, we are going to cycle through different views again, just as we did when we were in the shooting view. In the display view, we'll again cycle through no information, some information, and then a reduced size image with histograms. And if we're overexposing or underexposing an image, we'll get blinking highlights or blinking shadows to warn us of potential over or underexposure. Now just remember, the camera is previewing the JPEG or the embedded JPEG in the raw file. So in this instance, the tiny little preview is blinking in the sky, but it's actually not overexposed because on my zebras I've set that to 109 plus lower limit, and because the raw files have a little bit of headroom on the highlights for me to pull them back in post-production editing. Now, one of the views we can't cycle through in playback mode by pressing that display button is the grid view and calendar view. So we need to actually press the lower button on that control wheel with the little grid symbol there in order to look through the grid view of our images, and also the calendar view where we can look at all images shot on a particular day. Now, one of the things that we can do in playback mode is actually enable focus frame display. So I've done that here, and it's showing that the focus is actually on the eye of this tennis player here. Now, a word of warning, some people become over-reliant on this focus frame display, and it is known to make errors. And the errors it makes is usually when panning the camera quickly in sports or maybe birds in flight. The actual focus frame displayed is not actually the point at which the camera focused. Here's a classic example where I'm shooting MotoGP. The camera is being swung at a great rate of knots, and if I look at the focus frame display, the camera is telling me that I focused on the track, which is clearly not the case, as it is definitely the motorcyclist who is in sharp focus here. So just be wary of that one. Now, if we're not wanting to use the monitor, we can actually get a view on our tablet or our smartphone using control with smartphone. So once we've paired the camera with our smartphone and we're using the Creators app, we can actually take control over that view on using our smartphone or tablet. Just remember remote shooting when we're using the Creators app, and that will give us access to basically controlling the camera and viewing maybe on a larger screen with higher resolution than we're viewing on the camera itself. Now, remote shoot function for tethered shooting again is in the network settings, and this does allow you to tether the camera. Now you can tether to Sony's free Imaging Edge software, or we can tether to a popular app such as Lightroom itself. Control with smartphone needs to be off, tethering connection needs to be switched on. And then we can control that camera, and now we could be working on a laptop or a desktop computer and get full control over the camera, so we're no more reliant now on the small monitor view that we're being shown. Let's take a look at a few monitor settings that are basically only usable when we're doing movies. One of these is the emphasized record display. The cinematic cameras and premium level cine cameras from Sony usually have a tally light on the front of the camera which lights up a very bright little red light to show when the camera is actually recording. If we don't have that on the hybrid cameras, the alpha cameras, we can actually go to the shooting display, emphasize record display to on, and then the frame view of what we're doing as the monitor is facing us will now be outlined in red to say we're in recording mode, so you're no longer having to guess whether it's recording or not. Another useful one is the focus map, and this can be very useful when we're in manual focus and we're just pulling focus slightly, and the focus map will guide us into showing which is the area in sharp focus. Here now the foreground figurine, now let's pull back to the mid-distance one, and now to the full distance one, and that is maybe more useful for some photographers than the older style focus peaking. Another useful one for videographers shooting in the log profiles, or the S-log, is the clips can appear very low contrast, because the contrast and color is restored in post-production editing of those video clips. But this can be very off-putting when maybe a client is looking at what is being filmed, or we're just wanting to see a normalized view, and we'll basically deal with that low contrast clip in post-production editing. Sony's got you covered. Here we go to the setup display option, and we go to the gamma display assist type and just put that to auto, or we can choose exactly the profile that we're actually using by going into those options there. Setup display option when we're wanting to cycle between the S&Q mode and also the new time-lapse movie mode. This is where we do time-lapse movies and actually make those time-lapse movies recorded to the memory card. So if we want to get the choice when we go into the S&Q which one of those two we get, then you need to go to Shoot Mode Select Screen, and you want to enable that and set it to display, and then that will give you the choice whether you're choosing S&Q or the time-lapse movies option there. Now, another useful app when we're working with movies on the latest model cameras is to not just work with the Creators app, but also to work with the Monitor and Control app. We'll also get the option for touch focus here as well, so this is incredibly useful. And again, here I'm just showcasing using a phone mounted to the top of this Alpha 1 camera, but this could be a remote tablet that is not connected at all. If you found this video tutorial useful, then just give me the thumbs up. If you're wanting to access much more information in greater detail, then head over to patreon.com/Mark Gaylor, where I aim for all Alpha users to be able to master their cameras. I have ebooks, Q&A forums, member-only seminars. All of the raw files are available from my camera and lens reviews. Plus I have camera setup files, sometimes referred to as cam set files, for all late model Alpha cameras. And here's just a range of the 1 and 2 hour seminars that I create for my patrons here. And just remember, most of the late model Alpha cameras are covered by ebooks, which are usually longer than 700 pages. And remember, what we've been covering in this video is just that one contents listing there, Finder and Monitor. So you can see that there's a lot to get to master here if you're really wanting to get to grips and get the best out of your camera. So hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and I'm Mark Gaylor, Sony Digital Imaging Ambassador.